There are moments in life when the ground seems to shift beneath our feet, when the comfort we relied upon suddenly dissolves, and we find ourselves staring into a void we never asked for. Maybe it's the loss of something we thought we couldn't live without. Maybe it's a situation that caught us completely off guard, a betrayal, a disappointment, or a sudden collapse of plans we spent years building. In those moments, we feel cracked open, confused, even abandoned by the very life we've been trying so hard to live right. But what if, in that crack, something sacred was trying to emerge? What if everything that feels like it's breaking is actually reshaping you into someone who sees the world not through the eyes of control, but through the lens of understanding? That's not easy to accept when the pain is still fresh. But deep within teachings that have weathered centuries, like those from Buddhism, there is a whisper of truth, quiet but persistent. That whisper says, nothing is random. Every sorrow, every shakeup, every sleepless night is part of something larger than your current understanding can hold. Pain has a way of dragging us into the now, into a confrontation with reality that cannot be avoided. And in that meeting, there's a strange kind of alchemy. What we thought was here to hurt us begins to teach us. It doesn't mean the suffering is beautiful, it means it's meaningful, because the fire that burns you also reveals you. And maybe that's what we forget. Suffering isn't a punishment, it's a mirror. It shows us what we cling to. It unmasks the illusions. It humbles us, cracks the shell of who we thought we were, and pushes us toward a deeper truth. There's a story often told in Buddhist circles of a disciple who came to his teacher with frustration, drowning in what he called a cursed life, unfair, bitter, filled with struggle. The teacher, listening quietly, handed him a handful of salt and asked him to dissolve it in a glass of water and drink. The disciple took a sip and grimaced. It was unbearable. Then the teacher led him to a lake and told him to throw the same salt into its vast waters. When the disciple drank from the lake, the bitterness was gone. The teacher then said, "Suffering is like salt. The bitterness doesn't change, but you can. You can choose how wide you allow your heart to be." That story lingers because it reveals something we often forget. We cannot always control what happens, but we can choose the size of the space in which we hold it. When life shrinks, pain feels all-consuming. But when we expand our awareness, our compassion, our perspective, the same pain loses its sharpness. It becomes manageable, and eventually it becomes a lesson. That is not to say we invite suffering or pretend that loss isn't real, but we begin to walk with it differently. We begin to listen, not just run. The job that slipped away may have been the catalyst for discovering what you were truly meant to do. The relationship that ended may have returned you to a kind of love for yourself that you had given away too freely. The crisis that arrived uninvited may have been the fire that burned away illusions and introduced you to your real strength. The truth is, sometimes we don't get what we want because we are being led toward what we need. But it doesn't feel like that in the moment. In the moment, it feels like betrayal, like loss, like chaos. But chaos, though painful, can be a sacred disruptor. When everything is turned upside down, it's often because something deeper is being rearranged. Life doesn't destroy without intention, and when it does, it's rarely to hurt. It's to awaken. Comfort can make us complacent. Predictability can lull us into forgetting who we are. But pain breaks us open. It forces us to examine what we've been avoiding. It draws out the parts of us that are dormant, waiting to be seen. Think of a seed. A seed must fall apart in the soil. It must break open, unseen in the dark, before it becomes anything close to a tree. If you were to interrupt that process, if you pulled the seed back to the surface too soon, you'd stop its growth. The breaking, the darkness, the pressure, all of it is required, and so it is with us. The times that feel like endings may just be the quiet beginnings of something sacred. A new chapter that can only be written through surrender. And surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means softening your grip. It means leaning into the unknown without demanding answers. It means trusting that you don't need to have it all figured out to keep walking. In Buddhist wisdom, there's no promise that life won't hurt. There's only the assurance that the pain is never wasted. Every ache, every tear, every detour has the potential to bring you closer to truth, to clarity, to the person you were always meant to become. What if your suffering is not here to punish you, but to shape you? What if it's here to ask a question you've been avoiding? Who are you without that job? Without that title? Without that person? Who are you when all the noise fades and only your breath remains? In those questions is the invitation to rebuild, not from the past, but from the present. Not from who you were, but from who you're becoming. There's a quiet courage in asking, not why me, but what now? Because that's where transformation begins. That's where you stop resisting the fire and start letting it refine you. There's a tenderness in letting go of what could have been and opening your hands to what might be. Even when it hurts, even when it's unclear, there's no map for this journey, no guarantee of smooth roads. But there is a rhythm if you learn to listen, a pattern beneath the chaos, a wisdom inside the ache. And maybe, just maybe, the pain you're holding is not a detour. It's the exact road that leads you home. He had once believed that healing would arrive like sunlight breaking through clouds, suddenly, completely, and without warning. But it didn't come that way. It came slowly. It came quietly. It came disguised as conversations that challenged him, as mornings when he didn't want to get out of bed but did anyway, as long walks with no destination. Healing was not a dramatic transformation. It was a return, a remembering, a gathering of scattered pieces that he had left in different versions of himself across time. Some days he still felt the ache, the grief, the longing, but those feelings no longer scared him. He didn't panic at their return. He didn't label them as regression. They were just echoes. They were reminders that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about holding it differently. He learned to sit with the ache, not as an enemy, but as an old companion, one that walked beside him, not in front. It no longer led the way. It was no longer in charge. And in that shift, he found a subtle, powerful freedom. He began to notice how tightly he had clung to his identity, the image he projected, the role he played, the version of himself he thought the world wanted. That image had grown heavy. It no longer fit. It itched against his skin. So he started peeling it away, layer by layer, belief by belief. He no longer needed to be the strong one all the time. He no longer felt the urge to be the most accomplished in the room. He gave himself permission to be real, to be quiet, to be messy. And in that authenticity, he found people who didn't need him to perform in order to be loved. They loved him simply because he was. The idea of control began to dissolve too. He had spent years trying to plan every detail, to predict every outcome, to force life into the shape he imagined. But life refused to be tamed. It moved with its own rhythm. And the more he tried to dominate it, the more exhausted he became. Eventually, he let go. Not because he gave up, but because he finally saw the futility of gripping too tightly. Life wasn't meant to be controlled. It was meant to be danced with. It responded not to commands, but to surrender. And so he learned to move with it rather than against it. He started paying more attention to the present, not as a cliche, but as a practice. He had missed so many sunrises chasing a future that never arrived, missed so many moments with people he loved while replaying conversations from the past. Now he watched the sky change color as dawn broke. He listened when someone spoke, not just to reply, but to understand. He noticed the warmth of a mug in his hands, the feel of the wind on his face, the silence between songs. These things used to be background noise. Now they were the music. He began to untangle self-worth from productivity. There were days when he did very little by society standards, days when he didn't tick off any boxes or meet any external goals. But instead of spiraling into guilt, he placed a hand on his heart and reminded himself, I am not what I do. I am not what I achieve. I am not how busy I appear. He began to define worth not by output, but by presence, by the way he showed up, for himself, for others, for the moment in front of him. There was a period when solitude scared him, the silence, the stillness, the confrontation with his own thoughts. But now solitude became sacred. It became a sanctuary, a place where he met parts of himself he had forgotten. He stopped filling every gap with noise. He let himself sit in the quiet, and in that space, something tender awakened. He found that he didn't have to be surrounded to feel connected. Connection could exist in breath, in reflection, in the knowing that he was part of something larger, unseen perhaps, but deeply felt. He began forgiving, not just others, but himself, for the times he ignored his intuition, for the love he gave to people who couldn't receive it, for the moments he stayed silent when he should have spoken, for all the versions of himself who were doing their best with what they knew. He didn't rush the forgiveness. He let it unfold slowly. He let it break through him like dawn after a long night. And when it finally came, it didn't shout. It whispered, "You can begin again." He stopped looking for home in other people. He built it within, a place he could return to no matter what happened outside, a place where he didn't have to pretend or prove, a place where his emotions were allowed to exist without explanation. That inner home became his refuge, his compass, his sanctuary, and in building that home, he stopped fearing loneliness. Being alone didn't mean being lost. It meant being with himself. It meant choosing authenticity over proximity. He could sit at a table by himself and feel full, walk a familiar path without a companion and feel whole. Solitude, once a wound, had become a gift. He also began to observe how deeply society shaped him to seek certainty, to need plans, to demand closure. But the more he lived, the more he saw how rare certainty actually was, how often the real wisdom came not from answers, but from presence, from standing in the unknown and not rushing to fill it, from letting things be unanswered, unresolved, unfinished. That space, the one filled with questions, became sacred. Because in that space, he was alive, not certain, but awake. He began to live with more intention, less on autopilot, more on purpose. He paused before reacting. He questioned his assumptions. He asked himself not just, what should I do, but what feels true? He stopped moving through life trying to check off boxes and started asking, what matters most today? And often the answer was simple: honesty, rest, kindness, listening. Things that didn't earn applause but offered peace. He softened his expectations of himself, of others, of life. He let people be where they were. He let himself be where he was. He stopped demanding perfection from imperfect things. And in doing so, he stopped being disappointed by things that were never meant to meet impossible standards. He allowed joy to be quiet, progress to be slow, healing to be nonlinear, and he realized that every time he softened, something deeper emerged. Resilience not born of pushing, but of presence. Strength not built on resistance, but on surrender. He wasn't hardened by life anymore. He was opened by it, tenderized by the ache, made spacious by the silence. He became a vessel for peace, not because life had become easier, but because he had become more aligned. He noticed how often the voice in his mind still whispered old narratives, stories he had outgrown, beliefs he no longer resonated with, yet they still surfaced, quietly, subtly, persistently. The voice that told him he wasn't doing enough, that healing had an expiration date, that if he really had changed, he wouldn't still feel pain. He didn't silence that voice anymore. He sat with it, listened, and then gently asked, "Is this still true?" Most of the time it wasn't. It was just habit, echoes from a past that hadn't yet caught up with who he was now. And slowly those echoes faded, not because he fought them, but because he stopped feeding them. He stopped rushing to fix himself every time he felt broken. There was a time when discomfort triggered urgency, like he had to patch every emotional hole before anyone noticed. But now he allowed the cracks to exist. He understood they weren't flaws. They were access points. They let the light in. They reminded him he was human. And more importantly, they reminded him he was still growing. Growth didn't look like constant improvement. Sometimes it looked like learning how to sit with the parts of himself he used to reject, to hold them, not to judge them, to listen to them, not to exile them. He realized that love, true, grounded love, wasn't something you performed. It wasn't about proving yourself worthy, earning approval, or showing up with perfect timing. Love was presence. Love was patience. Love was sitting with someone and seeing them fully without trying to change them. And it started with him, with the way he loved himself when he was tired, when he was confused, when he didn't have the right words. That kind of love didn't always feel comfortable, but it felt real, and real was enough. He stopped measuring progress by how happy he felt. That kind of metric had failed him before, because healing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like shedding skin, like sitting in rawness, like weeping for no reason. And yet those moments were just as holy as the joyful ones, maybe even more. They were proof that he was no longer numb, that his heart had softened enough to feel again. And in that feeling, there was movement, even if it didn't look like it from the outside. He began treating his own pain as gently as he would a friend's. For years, he had offered compassion to others with ease, but held himself to impossible standards. Now, when sadness arrived, he didn't call himself weak. He made space. When anger flared, he didn't shame himself. He got curious. When confusion clouded his thoughts, he didn't rush to clarity. He waited. And that waiting, filled with silence, breath, and presence, wasn't passive. It was sacred. He started understanding that boundaries were acts of love, not rejection. That saying no wasn't unkind. It was honest. He didn't need to explain himself every time he protected his peace. He didn't owe guilt to people who didn't honor his space. He wasn't put on earth to be everything for everyone. He was here to be whole, to be true, to be deeply rooted in what kept his soul alive. He stopped chasing moments, stopped believing that the best of life was always just around the corner. Instead, he dug his hands into the soil of now, found magic in the mundane, realized that peace wasn't waiting at the end of a vacation or behind some future success. It was in the breath, in the pause, in the way sunlight filtered through the blinds, in the stillness of doing absolutely nothing and finally being okay with it. He no longer needed closure from people who couldn't offer it. That need had once kept him tethered to stories that were long over, but now he offered himself the ending. Not the kind with neat bows or perfect understanding. The kind that said, I release you, I release this, and I return to me. And that return, full of grief, full of grace, was more powerful than any apology he never received. He stopped fearing grief. He used to treat it like a wave to avoid. Now he saw it as a teacher, one that arrived unannounced, sat beside him, and whispered truths he needed to hear. That love still existed in the ache. That memory didn't need to be erased to find peace. that the capacity to mourn was the same capacity that allowed him to love so deeply in the first place. And so, he didn't fight grief anymore. He let it move through him, let it shape him, let it remind him that what he felt was sacred. He realized that the universe had never been against him. It wasn't cruel, it was just honest. It removed what wasn't aligned. It shook what wasn't stable. It exposed what was false, not to punish, but to purify. And the more he trusted that, the less he resisted change. He stopped praying for comfort and started praying for truth, even when truth was uncomfortable, especially then. He learned to walk away from what drained him, not dramatically, not in anger, but with clarity. He no longer stayed in rooms where his silence was more valuable than his voice. He no longer held on to connections that required him to abandon himself. Peace wasn't just a state of mind, it was an environment, and he had every right to protect it. He no longer needed every piece of his life to make sense. He didn't need to tie everything into a neat narrative. Some things happened without explanation. Some lessons unfolded over time. Some moments weren't meant to be understood, they were meant to be experienced. And the less he clung to meaning, the more he felt the miracle of simply being alive. He stopped comparing his path to others. What once triggered insecurity now stirred compassion. He saw everyone as walking their own sacred journey. Some arrived sooner, some took longer, but there was no behind, no ahead, just different chapters of the same story. He learned to cheer for others without diminishing himself. Their light didn't dim his, it added to it. He made peace with uncertainty. What used to paralyze him now became a canvas, a place where possibilities existed, where rigid plans melted into open roads, where curiosity replaced fear. He didn't need a perfect map. He only needed to keep listening, keep showing up, keep trusting that each step would lead him somewhere meaningful, even if he couldn't yet see where. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his life began to feel different. Not louder, not brighter, just more honest, more aligned, more him. He didn't need anyone to notice. He didn't need to broadcast it. He felt it in the way he exhaled more deeply, in the way he stopped bracing for impact, in the way he let love in, not just from others, but from himself. Because at the heart of it all, he had come home, to the body he once criticized, to the mind he once distrusted, to the heart he once protected. And that homecoming, that quiet, sacred return, was the most powerful transformation of all. He no longer waited for someone else to validate the life he was building. That wait had been long, exhausting, and silent. A quiet hunger had lived beneath his achievements, seeking a nod, a sign, someone to say, yes, you're on the right path. But now he had grown tired of waiting, not out of bitterness, but from clarity. He saw that the only approval that ever truly lasted was the one that came from his own soul. The feeling that said, this is right for me. He didn't need to convince anyone. He didn't need the applause. He only needed to walk his path in truth. He started choosing peace over performance. In moments where he once would have over-explained, he stayed quiet. When he used to stretch himself thin for acceptance, he now paused and asked, at what cost? When invitations came that didn't feel aligned, he respectfully declined. His peace was no longer negotiable. It wasn't something he earned through burnout or perfection. It was his foundation, his compass, his home. And with each decision rooted in peace, he felt himself returning more fully to who he truly was. He stopped seeing stillness as stagnation. There was a season when life seemed to pause. No growth visible, no milestones met. It felt like failure at first, like he was being left behind. But eventually he saw the truth. The stillness wasn't a stop. It was an incubation, a deep-rooted transformation happening beneath the surface. Seeds don't bloom the moment they're planted. Trees don't sprout during winter. And he wasn't broken. He was becoming. quietly, steadily, faithfully. And that quiet season, which once felt so empty, became one of the richest times of his life. He stopped mistaking productivity for purpose. For so long, his value felt tethered to how much he could produce, how many boxes he could tick, how efficiently he could move. But in the chase, he had forgotten how to simply be. Now he found purpose in presence, in showing up with his full heart, in listening deeply, in creating from inspiration, not pressure. He no longer needed to prove his worth through output. His presence was enough. His being was meaningful, even in rest. He no longer viewed vulnerability as a risk. There was a time when revealing his heart felt dangerous, as though honesty would only invite rejection. But slowly he began to share anyway, a little at a time. And he found that the more he showed up in his truth, the more others did too. Vulnerability didn't always lead to connection, but it always led to clarity. And he came to value clarity just as much. He no longer wanted surface closeness. He wanted something real, even if it required discomfort. He noticed that his breath had become his anchor. In moments of anxiety, he didn't need a solution. He needed breath. In conversations that brought up old wounds, he didn't need the perfect reply. He needed breath. In mornings where overwhelm knocked at the door before he even opened his eyes, he didn't need to fix everything. He needed breath. And with each inhale, he found space. With each exhale, he let go. It was the simplest thing and the most powerful, a reminder that he was alive, that he was here, that he could begin again. He had begun to crave silence, not just external quiet, but internal stillness. There was a depth to silence that nothing else could offer. It was where his clarity waited, where his intuition whispered, where his soul exhaled. He didn't fear silence anymore. He welcomed it, created it, protected it. And in that space, he met himself again and again, always a little more deeply. He became more discerning with energy, not out of judgment, but out of reverence for his time, his heart, his peace. He no longer gave access to everyone. He no longer answered every message, accepted every invitation, tolerated every presence, not because he thought he was better than anyone, but because he had finally realized how sacred his energy was, how deeply environments shaped him, and he wanted to be shaped by love, by stillness, by truth, not by chaos, noise, or the weight of others' expectations. He stopped romanticizing potential, his own and others. Potential had once kept him in places he had outgrown. It whispered promises of who someone could be, what a dream might become, how a situation might shift. But now he looked at what was, at the reality, and he honored that. If someone couldn't meet him in the present with respect and love, he didn't wait for a future version of them. He walked away, not with resentment, but with love, with faith that letting go made room for something more aligned. He began to walk through grief with grace, not as something to conquer or complete, but as something to carry. Some losses didn't have tidy endings. Some ache remained, but he didn't resist it anymore. He allowed it, made space for it, let it change him. Grief softened him, deepened him, made him more compassionate, and he realized that some griefs live alongside joy, not as enemies, but as quiet companions reminding him of how deeply he had loved, how much he had felt, how fully he had lived. He stopped pretending that forgiveness had to mean reunion. Forgiveness became a personal act, an offering to his own peace. It no longer required a conversation, no longer depended on the other person's remorse. Forgiveness became a door he walked through for himself because he didn't want to carry resentment anymore, because bitterness hardened him, and he had worked too long to stay soft. The loneliness transformed into a kind of companionship, an intimacy with his own presence. He didn't need constant conversation to feel alive. He didn't need to be surrounded to feel connected. He learned to sit with himself, and in that sitting, he found a kind of wholeness that nothing outside of him had ever been able to provide. He redefined peace. It wasn't about removing all stress or avoiding every conflict. Peace became the ability to remain rooted, even when the winds of life tried to pull him in different directions. It became the breath he returned to when chaos arrived. It became the way he spoke to himself when no one else was listening. Peace was no longer circumstantial. It was cultivated, chosen, nurtured. He began treating his time like something sacred. It was no longer just a resource to be spent, but a reflection of his values. He didn't give it away so easily. He didn't overextend just to be liked. He no longer said yes out of fear of being left out. Instead, he asked himself with each invitation, does this honor where I am? And when the answer was no, he declined, with kindness, but with clarity, because he finally knew. Every yes to something misaligned was a no to something sacred. He allowed slowness to become his rhythm. There was once a fear that if he slowed down, he would fall behind. But now he saw that the only thing he had ever fallen behind on was himself. Slowness allowed him to catch up, not to the world's pace, but to his own. And in that slowing, he began to notice the things that truly mattered. The warmth in his chest when he remembered he was loved. The lightness in his step when he moved without expectation. The fullness in his spirit when he gave without needing anything in return. He stopped searching for himself in others. That quest had left him fragmented. He would see reflections in someone else's love, someone else's attention, someone else's approval, and mistake it for truth. But mirrors can lie when you don't know your own shape. So now he went inward, not to isolate, but to root, to remember. And what he found there was not a version of himself molded to please the world. It was a version that had been waiting all along, whole, worthy, enough. He began giving himself what he had once begged others to offer: patience, forgiveness, space. He no longer needed to be rescued. He stopped handing out maps to his wounds, hoping someone else would bring the light. He became the light, the healer, the witness. And while he still welcomed love from others, he no longer depended on it for survival. His survival came from within, from the quiet, persistent love he had cultivated for himself. He embraced uncertainty with a tenderness that surprised even him. The fear was still there sometimes, of the unknown, of what might fall apart, of what might never come together. But he stopped letting fear dictate the shape of his life. He chose to meet the unknown with open hands, with a heart that said, even if I don't know what's next, I will still move forward. I will still trust. And in that trust, he discovered a courage that had nothing to do with being fearless. It had everything to do with being willing. He stopped idolizing healing as a final destination. Healing became less of a goal and more of a rhythm. Some days felt light, others heavy. Some moments brought clarity, others confusion. He didn't fight the cycle. He flowed with it. Let it wash over him. Let it shape him. And in that flow, he found something deeper than resolution. He found compassion, not just for himself, but for others too. For everyone stumbling through their own quiet storms. He didn't need to be loud to be heard anymore. He didn't need to take up space to prove he mattered. There was a quiet power in his presence now, in the way he listened, in the way he showed up, in the way he remained steady in the face of noise. And people felt it, not because he demanded it, but because he embodied it. That kind of presence couldn't be manufactured. It was born from the stillness he had made his home. He had once feared being misunderstood, but now he feared abandoning himself, and so he chose authenticity, chose truth, chose to be someone he recognized, even if others didn't. He no longer performed. He showed up, and the ones who stayed, the ones who saw him, felt him, loved him, were the ones who belonged. Because at the end of the day, he no longer lived to be liked. He lived to be real, to be whole, to be aligned. And in that alignment, he found everything he thought he had to earn: belonging, safety, freedom. All of it had been waiting inside him all along. He began to understand that not everything in life was meant to be solved. Some things were simply meant to be held, gently, like a fragile truth in the palm of your hand. There was once a time when every problem felt like a puzzle that needed fixing. Every emotion that surfaced had to be dissected. Every moment of discomfort met with analysis. He saw that not every chapter deserved a sequel, that some stories end, and that's okay. Closure, he realized, isn't always something you get. Sometimes it's something you decide. He no longer needed to understand why something ended in order to honor what it taught him. Some people were mirrors, some were messengers. All were meaningful, but not all were meant to stay. And perhaps the most beautiful shift of all was that he stopped needing life to be extraordinary, to be fulfilling. He no longer chased constant highs. He no longer needed drama to feel alive. He found joy in the simplicity, in the rhythm, in waking up and feeling peace, in going to bed without regrets, in the quiet, sacred repetition of a life lived in alignment. There came a time when he no longer viewed the quiet seasons of his life as empty or lacking. They used to scare him, those in-between spaces where nothing seemed to be happening. He mistook silence for stagnation, stillness for failure, but slowly something shifted. He began to see the stillness not as absence, but as preparation, a slow, deliberate forming of something deeper beneath the surface. Just like a seed takes root in the darkness before it ever breaks through the soil, he began to trust that the invisible work was often the most important, that even when life felt paused, his soul was still becoming. He stopped rushing to the next thing. There had always been urgency inside him, a silent panic that if he didn't move fast enough, life would leave him behind. So he hurried, he chased, he forced. But the more he leaned into the present, the more he saw that the most meaningful moments weren't the ones he ran to. They were the ones he allowed. He didn't need to make things happen before their time. He needed to make space. And the more space he made, the more naturally life flowed to him. He realized that not every difficult season meant he had taken a wrong turn. There were times when pain made him question everything, his choices, his path, his worth. But in hindsight, those were the seasons that shaped him the most, the ones that deepened his empathy, that stretched his patience, that made him more human. He stopped measuring his progress by how easy life felt and started measuring it by how present he remained, even when things were hard. That was growth. That was peace. Not perfection, but presence. He began to redefine success. It no longer looked like climbing ladders or accumulating praise. Success became the feeling of waking up without dread, of being able to sit with himself in silence and not feel the urge to escape. It became the courage to live authentically, even when it confused or disappointed others. Success became choosing peace over people-pleasing, truth over image, rest over performance. And with every redefinition, he felt lighter, freer, more aligned. He stopped arguing with reality. That fight had taken up so much of his energy, wishing things were different, replaying how they should have gone, clinging to what he wanted life to look like. But life wasn't interested in his scripts. It moved in its own way, in its own time. And when he stopped resisting that movement, when he surrendered to what was instead of what he thought should be, something unexpected happened. He found peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he was no longer at war with the present. He started talking to himself like someone he loved. That hadn't come easily. For years, his inner voice was sharp, critical, impatient. But as he softened outwardly, he realized he needed to soften inwardly too. So he rewrote the script. When he made a mistake, he didn't attack himself. He encouraged. When he felt afraid, he didn't mock his fear. He sat beside it. Slowly, that voice inside became a companion instead of a critic. And in that companionship, he felt safer than he ever had before. He stopped needing every relationship to last forever. Some connections came like seasons, beautiful, intense, but temporary. He used to cling, afraid that letting go meant failure. But now he honored the cycle. He let people go when their role in his story had been fulfilled. Not out of bitterness, but with gratitude. Because not everyone was meant to stay. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is release someone with love, rather than hold them out of fear. He began to let go of timelines, the idea that by a certain age he should have achieved specific things, that his path should look a particular way. He realized those timelines weren't his. They were inherited from culture, from comparison, from fear. And so he set them down, all of them. And in their absence, he created space to grow at his own pace, to arrive when he arrived, to trust that his journey was unfolding in perfect timing, even if it didn't look like anyone else's. He stopped trying to be understood by people who weren't ready to meet him. Need had kept him small, had made him shrink his truth into digestible pieces. But not anymore. He no longer distorted his essence for the comfort of others. He let his truth stand tall, even when it made others uncomfortable, because he finally understood that his job wasn't to be understood by everyone. It was to be true to himself. He began embracing simplicity. A simple life used to feel like a failure, like he had settled, but now it felt like freedom. He didn't need the noise, the chaos, the constant striving. He wanted ease, he wanted peace. He wanted mornings that began with breath instead of rush, evenings that ended with reflection instead of exhaustion. He found beauty in the ordinary, in the quiet, in the spaces in between. And that beauty was enough. He stopped confusing being needed with being loved. There was a time when he thought his value came from how useful he was to others. He overextended, overgave, overfunctioned. But now he saw the difference. Love didn't ask him to abandon himself. Real love saw him even when he wasn't performing. Real love stayed even when he set boundaries. And that kind of love began with him. He no longer sought to be the best, only to be himself. He had spent too long measuring himself against others, trying to prove he was good enough. But now he understood that his uniqueness was his power. He didn't need to compete. He needed to align, to follow what lit him up, to walk his own path with reverence, not rush. He began to slow down, not out of necessity, but by choice. The pace of the world no longer dictated his rhythm. He didn't feel guilty for resting. He didn't feel behind when he paused. Slowness became a practice, a statement, a way to reclaim his life from the hands of urgency. And in the slowing, he saw more clearly, felt more deeply, lived more fully. He let go of the need to be extraordinary. He no longer craved greatness that was loud and visible. He wanted depth, integrity, stillness, to live in alignment with his values, even when no one was watching. That was the life he desired, one built quietly, lovingly, authentically. And in that simplicity, he found everything he had been searching for. He started waking up each morning, not with dread, but with curiosity. What will today teach me? Who will I become? How can I live more honestly? These questions guided him, not as a checklist, but as a compass. And he followed that compass, breath by breath, step by step, building a life that didn't need to be perfect to be profound. He began to listen more to the pauses between his thoughts than the thoughts themselves. It was there, in the subtle silence, that he discovered his truest voice. Not the one shaped by anxiety or memory, but the one that came from a place far deeper than the mind. That voice didn't rush. It didn't panic. It spoke gently in moments of stillness, in fragments of breath, guiding him not toward answers but toward trust. He realized he didn't always need to know what was next. Sometimes he just needed to stop and listen. He saw how often he had once filled his life with distractions. Busyness had disguised itself as purpose. The endless doing had become a mask he wore to keep from feeling. To feel meant to confront what lay beneath: the grief, the longing, the questions that had no clear answers. But the more he slowed down, the less afraid he became of what he found inside. The distractions lost their appeal. They no longer numbed, they only delayed. And he didn't want to delay anymore. He wanted to feel, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it hurt. Because what he found beneath the discomfort was something honest, something sacred. He started to practice letting go, not as a performance, not to appear wise or enlightened, but because he realized holding on was costing him his peace. He used to grip so tightly to people, to outcomes, to expectations. But all that gripping had left him tired, and what he had feared would leave him if he let go often did. But what remained? That was the gift. What stayed, unforced, was what was meant to stay. And now he didn't beg things to stay anymore. He welcomed them while they were present, and when they left, he blessed them. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he had learned the difference between attachment and love. He realized how much of his energy had been spent trying to be understood. Every misinterpretation used to feel like an attack. Every silence used to feel like rejection. But now he understood that not everyone could see him clearly, not because he was invisible, but because they were looking through their own fog. And so he let go of the need to clarify, to explain, to defend. He trusted that those who were meant to walk beside him would feel him, even in his silence. And those who didn't, that was not his work to fix. He had once been afraid of being alone with himself. The solitude was unfamiliar. It felt like a room with no echo, but slowly, that silence became music.